Hello, and welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Goodwin, your host. This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer or artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field, along with past and current winners and a few surprise guests. Today's guest is Writers of the Future judge, Dean Wesley Smith, and this year's Writers of the Future writer winner, Preston Dennett. They're going to talk about a topic near and dear to a lot of you on never giving up, and it's otherwise known as the Topanga Canyon story. So welcome, Dean and Preston.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let me start the story by basically saying back in the early 90s, very early 90s, and late 80s, I was an editor. And I edited a magazine called Pulp House Fiction Magazine. My wife, Christine Catherine Rush, was editing the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And we were going to a lot of conventions and, of course, talking to the other editors, which included Gardner Dozois, Ellen Datlow at Omni, Stan Schmidt at Analog, and other science fiction editors like that. And we were talking, and editors sit around in bars and talk. And one of the things that is a common conversation, which probably would scare the heck out of most young writers if they knew it, is that we talk about the young writers that we're following, that we're watching close, and in some way that are close to selling to one of us. And so it sort of becomes this fun kind of thing among editors to say, well, I'm going to buy his first story, or no, I probably will, or I will. And chances are we all thought it was going to be me buying your first story back then, because what occurred was that usually if Gardner and then Chris rejected at FNSF, Pulp House was like third or fourth on the list. And so I tended to take stories that they couldn't take, that had a little more of an edge and all that. So we were talking about this one young writer who was really hitting us hard and all the time. And we called because you had a very, very unusual address in Topanga Canyon. And so we started referring to have you bought Topanga Canyon yet? No, I haven't. Oh, that last story is, And so we were actually talking about your stories a lot, because he was doing it right. He was sending us a lot of stories continuously, and he was keeping them in the mail. So if Asimov rejected it, Chris would see it at FNSF or whatever, the order was. I would eventually see it, and I would turn to Chris and say, have you seen this story yet? And she'd say, oh yeah, I liked it. I couldn't buy it because of, and that sort of stuff. So editors do that behind the scenes, and usually the young writers that are going to break in really strong don't know that they're close. They don't have any idea how close they were. And Topanga Canyon was very, very close. It was just a matter of who was going to buy them first.
Wow. So, Preston.
Oh, God, hearing this. No, I didn't know. I really did not know I was that close. I was pumping them out. I'd written, 47 stories initially, starting in 1986 is when I still really started writing. Right when the Writers of the Future came out, I started submitting there, certainly, and to all the magazines.
And you did it right by keeping them in the mail. That's how we saw you.
Second I got a rejection, I had another one ready. And meanwhile, I was writing another one. And I do remember your rejections. They were very kind. You often gave me some great encouragement. Keep going, you're close. Got a personal from Christine. And Stanley Schmidt, too. One magazine pro, I won't say who it was, told me, you're not improving, stop sending us stories. I'm like, oh, God.
No, you were improving. You were improving.
That was pretty, that hit me a little hard. But I didn't know I was close. I did not realize that personal rejections were actually something really valuable.
Yeah, we should probably mention that. If an editor takes time to actually write a writer a note, a personal note, and versus a form rejection, that editor thinks that they're going to buy a writer's story soon. That's what that means. Very close, especially if they say, this was close, it didn't quite work for me, please send me your next one, I'm looking forward to it. If an editor says something like that, they truly mean it. And, and that's...
There's no obligation to say something.
You can just form reject it out. If the story doesn't work or you don't get very far in it, you just put a form on it. And, and that's what that means. It wasn't there. But if an editor read all the way through it, and it was close, they feel obligated to write a letter, even if it's only a short note. And in fact, I think I was typing my rejections on a typewriter. So was Chris at FNSF. at that point.
Yeah, I was using a typewriter too.
Yeah.
This is before computers, so it's a little more difficult, and you had to wait quite a while to get a response, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And getting a personal response was great, but I didn't realize how great it was. I really didn't. I didn't think editors knew me, really. I thought, gosh, each story is a new story. They don't remember. They get thousands of stories. How could they possibly know?
You want to know how we know? Is because you were sending them in regularly. And so what occurs is the name starts floating up. And if the stories are close, editors pay attention. And then it's suddenly like, oh, yeah, that story, I just read one from him just not long ago. And so that's why you don't want to wait a long time between sending stories to editors. You want to just keep a story on editor's desk all the times. And then they remember the writer, because we care about writers who are trying. We don't want to just buy one story from a writer and then have them go away. That's a nightmare because it costs us money to put them in a magazine. Mm-hmm. What we want is a writer who's going to sell us a story, then sell us another one, then eventually sell a story where readers are starting to read their story a lot and liking them, and then we can move their name to the cover, and they become a cover name. And when you're a cover name, you sell books,
right?
And that's the goal. So we like writers who are being very, very, very consistent. That's why we remember them, like we remembered you.
Yeah, well, I wanted to do it. This is what I wanted to be. I'd read every author I could get my hands on, but I was unpublished. I didn't have a single story out there. And as far as the writers of the future, reject. I mean, I can go on. I was rejected 12 times without a single honorable mention. So I'm like starting to get a little discouraged here. And I was putting out an enormous amount of energy, a lot of time, and it wasn't happening.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
I mean, at some point, I'm like, I'm not sure if this is for me, because, gosh, I've been writing for 3-4 years now, and didn't get published.
Yeah.
And I wrote an article that was nonfiction, and it got the front cover of the newspaper, and then a magazine. Mm-hmm. So I started to get diverted a little bit. I thought, you know what, this might not be for me. It's an awful lot of work. And I gave up. I did. I didn't want to. I was in love with science fiction. Uh-huh. I had a love affair. And it was like, an end of a love affair. Yeah. It was devastating. I had 200-300 books. I sold them all. I'm like, that's it. I'm going to make a clean cut, because this is a painful relationship.
I can understand that.
And I did save the Writers of the Future books, by the way.
Yeah.
I boxed them up and I cried because I thought I was going to win that contest. Mm-hmm. I really kind of knew I could, and I really thought I would.
Yeah.
And so it was devastating to have to, end this relationship. Mm-hmm. I wasn't going to waste my time. I mean, you can only run a marathon for so long before you start to get tired.
I did that. That's why I told that story earlier. It's from 74 to 82. Not one sale, not nothing.
Yeah.
It was it was. That's why I was just about to give up too when I found Heinlein's Rules.
I thought it was good. I thought some of my stories were pretty good, and I was getting encouragement, but they just weren't good enough. So I'm like, all right, maybe I don't got it.
No. Yeah. Was that next? You had to just get over the top on that. Something would have clicked, and you would have gone over. And once a story gets bought, that's why we were all paying attention. Because once a story gets bought by a professional level magazine like Pulp House or Asimov's or FNSF, then all the other editors take their standards and lower them. I'm not kidding you. We literally will go, a story that we would have rejected or not quite close if it was a first sale, we'll buy it for a second or third sale. And I know that's another one of those nasty secrets behind the scenes in the editing world. But, once we know a writer breaks through, they're going to be around, then we will give it more.
I wish I knew some of this, boy.
Yeah.
Because
I wouldn't have stopped. There's no way for writers to know that, except for a podcast like this. Mm-hmm. There's no way for writers to really understand that merry-go-round, that wheel of difficulty.
Yeah, I did attend one convention. I wasn't a huge convention attender, but I did attend one, and just kind of pulled back because I really wanted to put my attention on writing itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the correct thing to do, but you actually have to balance the business side and the learning side too. And I got a rejection from Asimov's. I've never been published in Asimov's. My wife is the number one writer at Asimov. She is the number one.
Right.
But I've never been published there. And so I was about to send off a story about a year and a half ago, and I thought, I'm going to give them another try, give Sheila, because all the editors were my friends, and so I was always rejected by my friends, and because I never would quite write the story that would fit. And I said, well, I'm going to figure out what I'd done. And I counted all of the rejections that I got from Asimov's magazine. I am, at this moment in time, at 250 different stories.
Wow.
Rejected from Asimov. All 4 of the editors, since the first day Asimov magazine started, I was rejected 250 times, 250 different stories at Asimov's. And yet, I'm a New York Times bestseller, and I've been around, and 23 million copies of my books in print and everything else, and I can't sell a story to Asimov. Now I can't sell a story to Asimov because I don't send them any.
Right.
Yeah. I kind of like the 250. It's a nice round number. So that's part of publishing. It's just
back
the rejection.
in the 80s and the 90s, there weren't a whole lot. I mean, today there's 100 markets,
there's
200,
so many,
300.
Yeah, there's so many markets
There was
now.
5 or 10 pro magazines.
Yeah, you could keep it through the mid
was
group,
about it.
And then you'd have to retire the story. And when you retired a story back then, there wasn't indie publishing like there is now. So when you retired a story, it went into a file.
I still have that file, by the way.
Yeah, there's a lot of file.
So how did it then transform? So now let's move forward. What, 15 years, 10 years?
17.
17 years. Okay,
Wow.
now let's roll forward
Wow.
17 years.
Yeah, I was at work, actually. I do work full time. I did very well with nonfiction, but still wanted to be a science fiction writer. And realized I was getting old. And I thought, gosh, one of these days I'm going to have to look back into that. But was scared, terrified, really. Mm-hmm. And my boss walks in with E. Doc Smith's Lensman series. He had just read it. This was old classic pioneering stuff. And he's like, read this. You should read this. Do you like science fiction? I'm like, well, I used to. And he's like, read this. And he's my boss. So I'm like, okay, got to please the boss. Uh-huh. And I read it. And it all came rushing back, that old love. Because this was a good series. It's a little dated now.
Yeah.
But it's got this rollicking, space opera adventure stuff that I really liked. I really like the classic sci-fi adventure stuff. That's sort of my wheelhouse, I guess. Mm-hmm. And boy, it just came tumbling back. I fell in love. I actually bought all the books I had sold, bought all the Writers of Future books, and
the ones that you'd missed since then?
Right.
Yeah.
Pulled the ones out of the closet, read all those, of course. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, wow, the Writers of the Future is still going on. And of course, the science fiction market now is huge. There's all these paying markets. There's computers. You don't have to send your stories out on snails.
Yep.
And so it was a lot easier in a lot of ways. I thought, I'm going to give it a try. Why not? But I'm not submitting to any magazines. No way. I'm just going to start with the Writers of the Future because it's the place to go.
It's the top market. Yeah. It's the top market.
And they give you honorable mentions. So I thought, well, if I earn an honorable mention, maybe I'll submit to a magazine. I got an honorable mention after, actually, I got rejected first. Actually, it wasn't the first time I entered the contest, but first in 17 years. Got another rejection, another straight rejection, another straight rejection. Then I think it was my 17th, 16th entry. I got my first honorable mention. Hit the ceiling. I couldn't believe it. This was the best news as far as I was concerned. And still didn't have, it wasn't quite enough. Because I had, that real confidence problem that apparently I've been talking to these other winners. Are we really good writers? No, we're not. And it's a real confidence problem among writers. And I had it bad.
It's uniform.
And I thought,
it's among every level. It never goes away.
So I kept submitting to only the Writers of the Future. And finally got, another honorable mention and another. Actually, pretty quickly, I started to learn my craft, certainly, and thought, okay, I'll start submitting to the magazines. I couldn't believe it. I started getting personal rejections immediately.
Yep.
I'm like, wow, this is fantastic. Then I got a sale. I'm like, oh, wow, this can't be. It was a good sale, Andromeda Spaceways.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, not a pro level.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty good sale. That's a good sale.
Yeah, got the cover, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, he did. Yeah.
And I immediately sent another story to them. Mm-hmm. Immediately. It fell right up into their, the top of their pile. They go through this weird tier process. Mm-hmm. And they liked it so much, they put it in the same issue as the other magazine. So I got 2 stories in Andromeda Spaceways, same issue.
Wow.
Which I don't know if anyone has done that.
No.
So I'm like, all right, I'm back in.
Yeah.
And I was submitting like furiously to everybody, and doing pretty well. Not with the pro level, but I did have a lot of semi-pro sales and a few token. Some people don't submit to token. I kind of wanted to crack every market.
Exactly.
That's
Especially
just,
after the first experience, I would feel the same way. Yeah.
And because putting all this energy out and getting even a token sale gives you the inspiration and the encouragement you need to keep going.
Sure.
And so that's what I did. But I still had my eye on the Writers of the Future because I knew I could win it. I did.
Yeah.
I knew I could win this. And I just sit there, look at those books, and just get a little teary-eyed. I'm like, one day I'm going to win this contest. And you guys started inviting me to see the gala, and that was even more encouragement that I needed. What really worked for me in terms of learning how to write and encouragement was the Writers of the Future forum. So I would go on that daily. And the forum is, a community of people who are entering the contest and sharing advice and, talking about, what David Farland is looking for as the first reader of the contest. And so that's where I kind of lived, and that's where I really sort of learned how to become a writer and learned how to get the encouragement I needed to keep going. So each honorable mention that came in was like, yay, yay. And I racked them up. Let me tell you, I got 12 of them, but couldn't get past it. Could not get past the honorable mention.
So you've been doing this for 4 or 5 years since you came back.
Yeah, it was 2009 about when I came back.
Wow.
And I entered every single quarter. I didn't miss a quarter. And often it was, last 3 days, I'm like, oh gosh, I've got nothing, let's pound it out. And that's what I did. And it was usually, the second to last day I would enter, because I didn't want to be the last day kind of guy. And I would enter in the second to last day, every single quarter, and boom, 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 boom. And I just couldn't get past the honorable mention barrier. I was starting to get really discouraged again. And that is when I came upon this thread about not giving up. One of these, there's different threads in each of these.
In the forum.
That talk about, don't give up, or, hard sci-fi while you write. And one of them was about not giving up. And I came upon this. One guy's like, don't give up, never give up. And another guy responded, don't worry, I would never give up because I've heard the Topanga Canyon story. And I got a cold chill, a real cold chill. And I'm like, okay. And I replied, I'm like, can you tell me a little bit about this Topanga Canyon story? I don't know anything about it. And he says, oh yeah, this is a workshop actually that was taught by Dean Wesley Smith. I'm like, Dean Wesley Smith, I know him. First, One Last Dance, first issue. He's a judge. I'm like, oh God, tell me more. And it's a workshop about not giving up. There's this guy named, we'll call him Topanga Canyon in quotes, who basically editors were talking about him, like you said, and even book editors and people were looking for him at conventions and wondering, this.
Yeah, we kept looking for you.
Who was going to publish his first story and blah, blah, blah. And one day he just disappeared off the face of the planet. Stopped sending. No one knew if he had even died or what went wrong with him. And I'm like, oh God, that's me. And I don't know, I don't think there's an emotion for this, but I was devastated and so excited. I was thrilled to know that, gosh, I was there. I was good.
You were there.
They did know me. They knew me. That was amazing. But I gave up. And I'm like, oh my God, this is the worst news ever. Because I was there. I could have had my dream 17 years ago come true. And so it was good, bad news. Mostly good, I'll say, but there was this undercurrent of devastation that just tore my heart out. But it gave me the inspiration, certainly.
Yeah.
The first thing I did actually was contact you, Dean. And I'm like, is this me? I mean, this you might not remember. I wasn't sure if you would.
Oh, I did.
I'm like, but I'm this guy from Topanga Canyon who was submitting furiously, and I was just wondering if this workshop could it be about me? No worries if it's not. And like, yeah, it is. Is that okay? I'm like, are you kidding? I'm a cautionary tale. How awesome is that?
So how do you use the cautionary tale in your workshop? How are you using that?
It was exactly for that. Don't give up, because you don't know behind the scenes what's going on, especially when you're submitting out to markets and stuff. You just don't know. The reason I wasn't a judge 9 years later, you guys asked me to be a judge, and on the second year I was doing Strange New Worlds for pocketbooks. Strange New Worlds was a contest patterned after Writers of the Future for Star Trek. And I did Dave Farland. I was the editor.
Right.
And so what occurred in that, and I saw the behind the scenes on that too, is that people were sending me all these Star Trek stories every year. And I only had one volume, and I only had 17 stories or 23 stories I could pick every year. And I was getting thousands of submissions. And I'd wait and put them all together and then do them over a couple-week period of time. Well, that allowed me to really start seeing the names, not only the ones that I was buying, and the rules were you couldn't have more than 3 published stories. So it was a contest for Star Trek, published by Pocket, that was exactly patterned after Writers of the Future. And I was the editor on that for 10 years. Well, after 5 or 6 years, I had a group of people that were really close, and it was because of the experience with you, I started telling them how close they were. I literally started writing letters to people saying, next year, do this. You're really close. You need to get your regular writing out to regular markets, not just Star Trek, because they couldn't do anything. If I rejected them, their story was dead. They had no other markets. And so I was actually, because of your story and what happened with you, I decided I was never going to keep that behind the scenes again. And I helped a lot of writers, actually not stop. And a lot of writers came out of those 10 years of Writers of the Future, but I couldn't become a judge on Writers of the Future because I was Strange New Worlds. Right. I was doing the exact same contest. I couldn't be in both. And so the minute we shut that down at Pocketbooks after 10-year run, then I was able to Chris and I was able to jump on here,
which is great.
And what little bit we do here, but so and support this. So we're always supporting new writers, but I decided no more of we talk about it, but we don't tell the writer. And we all wanted to meet you. So if you'd have been going to conventions, one of us would have spotted you.
I should have done. Yeah, I regret that. It's another regret about all of this.
Yeah, we would have. One of us would have been sitting on a panel and looked out and seen your name and gone, "Oh, got to talk to you." And literally, we would have said that. We would have pointed to you in the audience and said, "Talk to me after the panel." And you're that. This happens with all of the major writers that came in, like Lucius Shepard. He was the most famous unknown writer. All the editors knew him, just like we all knew your name, before he ever got published. And then Terry Carr bought Lucius's first story, and then Terry died, and the whole project went away. And then somebody else bought a story, and that folded. And Damon Knight bought Lucius's first story, which was with my first published story, about 2 months before Writers of the Future. And it was called The Clarion Awards, edited by Damon Knight. And Lucius, Nina, and I all had our first pro stories together. But Lucius was so well known. He was just unbelievable out there in those days. And just what happened with you, about 5 years later after Lucius, you were the big name out there that everybody was watching. And it was so close. And I'm sorry
me.
Yeah, I know. But it just one of those things where
feels good though at the same time.
So. Yeah, you have the skills and you have the stories and you have the drive. And that's what editors look for, is that drive, that persistence, that push. So
that's awesome. So after 47 entries and how many years since you started?
It was 9 years about.
No, from the get-go when you first started entering in 1980.
86 what or 80 86
So it's been 33 years
35 years 33 years
33 years. Wow. So that is absolutely the ultimate in don't give up.
Yeah,
that's an amazing story. So as we wrap this up, then any particular thing you'd like to say to other people?
Well, don't give up for one thing. And because getting that call from Joni that I'd won, I'm like, wow, I have got to call Dean now. Yep. I am going to call him. Actually, I wrote you the next day.
You wrote me the next day, yeah.
I'm like, guess what? Yep. This is going to knock your socks flat off. And I'm sure it did.
Oh, yeah, it was so cool. I was so excited.
To have that kind of happy ending to a story.
Yeah.
And I would tell anyone who's out there submitting, always have another story ready. Mm-hmm. And do realize that if you get a personal rejection, it's huge. As is an honorable mention. It's absolutely a great sign. That
and Writers of the Future, we get a lot of entries, and that's a capital L on lot. And so if a person gets an honorable mention, it used to be when we at the get-go, we would, I think our first year we had like 300 and some odd entries.
Yeah,
I don't think
AJ did honorable mentions back in those
no,
days. Did he?
There was no need to.
No need to. Yeah.
But now we're up to maybe 150 honorable mentions in a quarter. But that's the amount that it's grown, and the amount now that an editor, when they see someone that puts the fact that they're an honorable mention on their resume, on their pitch letter, it will pull them out of the slush pile because it's known how much comes to Writers of the Future, and when someone makes that cut and is called that, they know that okay, they've already worked themselves up to that level of.
Yeah, we talked about that on the forum. Do you put an honorable mention in somewhere? Like, no, it just means you got rejected. I'm like, I put them in, started selling them.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, no, and on that was the only thing I had. I had nothing but an honorable mention to say. Some of the workshops that we teach, the writers will come back on and say, "Oh, I got an honorable mention this time," and I like that. And I'll always say congratulations. Yeah. I always say congratulations. That's close. That's like a real nice personal letter from an editor. That's what that is.
I mention my win now when I enter.
Absolutely.
Charlie at FNSF, he's like, congratulations, man, that's cool.
Oh, yeah.
So there I'm in with FNSF now. He knows me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and editors follow Writers of the Future.
100%.
Absolutely. Yep. So that's well done to you, obviously, on a dream come true. And any last comments from you, Dean?
Just don't stop. It really, I'm a prime example of not stopping, after all these decades and decades now, and I had that long period too. I had an 8-year period where I just couldn't sell anything and early on and nothing would sell. And so whether you're doing traditional markets or whether you're indie publishing or whatever you're doing, the key is just keep learning the craft, keep working to be a better writer with every story, and don't stop. Keep them out there. Get them out to readers, out to editors.
And one last point I didn't say was that Dean was the very first person to have ever walked on the stage and be recognized by Writers of the Future 35 years ago.
35 years ago, yeah.
It's amazing.
Can't believe
there's a story arc for you.
Definitely there's a story arc.
Yeah, and I have a story in this new volume because I got to write the story around the cover, around Bob Eggleton's wonderful cover.
And it's an
so
awesome
perfect.
cover.
I have a story in the same book as Dean.
That's right.
Wow.
Okay, well, thank you all for listening. Stay tuned for our next show. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Writers and Illustrators of the Future are contests created by L. Ron Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged. It is free to enter and open to new and amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy.